Candice and I are going to talk you through some of the features that mylife Loop can really help for young children. My name is Cliona Miles. I'm a diabetes educator by background. I now work for Ypsomed Diabetes Care. So really delighted to be here today. And I'm going to let Candice introduce herself.
Thanks, Cliona. I'm Candice Ward. I am also a diabetes educator. I worked many years at a big hospital in Cambridge in the UK, delivering a clinical service for type 1 diabetes. But luckily enough, Roman Avorka was doing his research in the same building. And so we've walked a long journey through all the research and are now supporting him commercialize the CAM-APS algorithm across the world. So we're here, we're delighted to share the clinical experience we've gained to date in using this amazing closed loop system in very young children. So Cliona, I'll pass back to you.
Thank you. Yes, so very exciting. So what we're going to do today is we are going to give a brief overview of the clinical research, just touch really quickly on this, how mylife CAM-APS works, and the limitations and I suppose the challenges that this age group can bring. Then I'm going to pass over to Candice to go through more of the features and optimizing the system. And then at the end we'll have some time for questions. Let's get straight into it. So here is just a few of the clinical papers that are an example of showing how this system has some very strong research-based evidence, over 20 years experience in lots of different age groups, showing increased time and range with no increased hypoglycemia, increased HbA1c, reduced HbA1c, but also more importantly, improved quality of life for our families and children. So here you can see this is some of the papers that have been published previously. There are some more in the pipeline. You can see that there is many studies with lots of different age groups. So very strong evidence that this system is used safely and effectively in lots of age groups, but obviously today we're focusing on young children. So here's two papers that just mention the importance of technology and a closed loop system to families of young children. So this first paper in 2019, they looked at children between ages 1 to 7, and they really looked at the quality of life, and parents said things like they were 90% were less worried, 90% had less trouble sleeping, 85% spent less time actually having to manage diabetes. So that means an awful lot to those families. This second paper in 2021 looked at qualitative data, and there's some quotes here. I particularly love this one that says, she can be playing in the garden outside and I can just kind of hang out the window and give her insulin and I don't have to stop what she's doing. So that means an awful lot when a child can be a child and they can play and they can do all the normal things that children can do without diabetes having to get in the way. So I think that is very powerful.
Absolutely right. It's not all about the numbers, is it? We obviously want to get the HbA1cs and time in hypoglycemia as optimal as possible, but it's also the quality of life of that individual and their family and also siblings. Exactly. So yeah, great.
Yeah, exactly. So how does it all work then? So here is the Ipso pump. So we know that this is one part of the mylife Loop. So this obviously talks to the app. It's the system delivers insulin by the app really taking over control. So the backup basal rates aren't used. They're just used in open loop, but it still does require some pre-meal insulin for carbohydrates. So this is just kind of going through how predictive and adaptive the algorithm is. So you can see here, the CGM will update the app every 1 to 5 minutes with new data. Also then on the side here, you can see that there might be some boluses or anything that the user inputs. The algorithm then learns what the insulin sensitivity is and tries to predict what the future glucose levels is. So the algorithm is really working hard to take all of these things into consideration in order to optimize this insulin infusion. So really to give the best insulin infusion that it knows possible. And then it adjusts every 8 to 12 minutes to do this. So you know that it's very adaptive and it's really trying to work with the child as best as possible to give the needs, the insulin needs for them. So the algorithm is constantly learning as well, and so it's taken into account the total daily dose of today, and it takes into account that tomorrow. It also looks at different patterns throughout the day as well, and so the more it learns, the better it kind of works for the child. Here is just an example of when you turn the phone on the side, you can get this horizontal view, which is really nice at your fingertips. You can see this nice graph, and this just shows an example of where there was a rise here late at night, and you can see that because the glucose levels rose, so did this adaptive basal rose, but it actually then fell. And I know some people might be wondering, why is this? Well, actually, the algorithm was predicting that over here, there potentially was a hypoglycemia. So it looked at, okay, maybe we'll give less here in order to protect this. And then it really nicely skimmed and came back up again, and there was no hypo here. So you can see it's constantly predicting, constantly adapting, which is exactly what you need. And it looks like here, maybe this carb ratio maybe needed to be stronger so that this peak didn't happen. So it's really trying to help any of these carbs that were missed, but then also trying to protect from that hypoglycemia. So constantly trying to adapt and predict those levels. So CAM-APS learning. So when you initially set it up, you type in the body weight and the total daily dose. And the body weight can be constantly updated, which is obviously great for a growing child. So you can constantly update the kg or the body weight of the child. The total daily dose doesn't need to be updated because actually the system is learning all the time and is adapting to the needs of the child. The AID calculations are not influenced by the settings. So the settings are important in the pump because they're the backup settings. If something happens or during a sensor warm up, you have those backup rates for the basal just to kick in. But the AID calculations are not influenced by these. So they really are adaptive and trying to predict as much as it can the child's needs. It does still include a bolus calculator, so you still can tap on the screen and bolus for meals. That's still important. So there is a carb ratio and an insulin sensitivity factor programmed into the app as well, and an active insulin time. It is highly adaptive, so it looks at, as I said, the daily insulin needs, the day-to-day insulin needs, and then the post-meal insulin needs. So actually, if a user can kind of let the app do its thing, it will work better. So it will learn what's needed and try and figure out the pattern of the child. So looking at those challenges that this age group can bring, every day is different. I'm sure we can all agree with that. Increased day-to-day variation. So we know that as they grow, their needs change. Even day to day, it can be difficult. We mentioned here that often there's a low insulin requirement during the night and then a high insulin requirement during the late evening. So, based on those growth hormones and things like that, even the hours of the day can have different insulin requirements. Total daily dose obviously increases quite rapidly compared to adults because of growth and weight gain of children. So I suppose this does take a lot of adjusting and trying to figure out doses, but actually this is where an adaptive closed loop like this can really help, because it really tries to help with those frequent changes. Unpredictable eating behaviors. So we know that what maybe they eat today, they don't like tomorrow. Unfortunately, that is some reality of this age group. Also things like frequent grazing. So, some children eat little and often with very small meals. So at least now we have a system that you can type in the carbs and you don't have to actually even go near the child. You can be doing it from the phone, which is great. You don't have to interrupt the child, as we mentioned earlier. Food refusal. There is settings in the system, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that can help with things like that. Things like weaning, milk formula, breastfeeding. All of these create a lot of challenges for this age group. Parents will think about, how much bolus do I give if I don't know how much they're going to eat? What time do I bolus them? Do I bolus them 5 minutes beforehand, 10 minutes beforehand? All of these decisions can be really tricky. And the carbs that they're going to eat. Also unpredictable activity. So we know that this is another thing that can really influence glucose levels. So really important to have a system that tries to minimize this as much as possible. So there is some functions again on the mylife loop, which we will talk about, that will help with unpredictable activity, because we know that we can't limit this for children. This is also a very important part of growing up. And unanticipated glucose rise. So you can see here, this is just an example of a child who's eaten the same meal, and it's the same child and the same meal bolus given, but actually there's two different outcomes. And this is probably to do with a lot of other things that are going on in the body, like hormones and different things like that. So night-to-night variability can also be really tricky. But again, this is where the adaptability of the algorithm can really help with this. So the medical indication then, so it is for children with type 1 diabetes from the age of 2 years and up, depending on which sensor is used. Weight of 10 kg and up, total daily insulin of 5 units and up, and the CAM-APS FX is CE and FDA approved for type 1 diabetes in pregnancy as well. So it is the only indicated closed loop for that. So some of the features then. So we talked about the challenges of children in this age group, but actually what are the features that can help? So there's some really nice, adaptable, customizable, personalized features of the system. Also things like the fact that it's controlled by an app, which makes it really nice and flexible for the user. There is a really easy bolus calculator that can be used on it. And also you can put in different meal sizes. So if you know a child always eats the same breakfast, for example, that can be programmed in. It also has the CGM alerts on the app. So this is great. It's really just one app that they need to use. It's all there. Then there's also, it links to glucose. So the caregivers and the HCPs love this because they can access the data and really go back to analyze, lots of weeks and days. So it's great that it uploads to Gluco. You can also get a 2-week PDF report direct from the app. So if maybe a caregiver wanted to send it to another family member or something like that, you can just download the PDF really easily directly from the app. So really easy to use. There's also text messages which you can get sent to caregivers for alerts. So parents love this for things like nursery and stuff like that. SMS can come up on their smartwatch, for example. So they love that example. And then also we've got the CAM-APS companion app, which really mimics what the app shows on the child's phone. So this is something that parents love as well, because you can see exactly what the system is doing, even when you're not with the child. So if they're in school or nursery, for example, the parent can follow along. The parent can't bolus or anything from theirs, which is obviously a safety feature, but they can see what the algorithm is doing and what insulin's given. And that's really handy for things like if they want to check up that they did have their lunchtime insulin, for example, they can see that all on the phone. So it creates less of that kind of, communication that has to go on around diabetes all the time. They don't have to ask, did you bolus for lunch today? They can just see it on their app, which is actually really nice. And again, it lets a child be a child, doesn't it? So here's just more on to the personalization. So we can see here that we have the personal glucose target. So this is something that is really customizable in this system. So you can have up to 48 time segments, and you can make it really personalized for the child. So if you have a child that runs particularly low during school, for example, or during nursery, so you want to make that that basal rate really reduce it, then you can have a high personal glucose target. And then maybe after dinner they need more insulin, so you can make that personal glucose target stronger there. And then again, at the different periods of the night, you can flex it for that as well. So really nice and adaptable. The insulin carb ratio, so you can even do this by decimal points, so you can be really precise, which is really important for children, because some children, you don't just want to go 1 gram to 2 gram, you actually want to go in steps. So actually that can be really nicely done as well in the insulin to carb ratio. The boost option is there, so this is really unique to mylife CAM-APS. So if there's those periods of time where maybe there's like illness or sickness or something like that, they've got an option to tell the algorithm that it can be a little more intensive if it wants to be. And then on the flip side, we have the ease off option, which can tell the algorithm to be a little bit, easy. So this is really helpful for things like exercise. So maybe that unpredictable activity that we talked about. So here, as I mentioned, the personal glucose target. So it defaults to 5.8, which is 104 in deciliters. So it defaults to this, but again, you can adjust it to whatever you want, between 4.4 and 11 millimoles in 48 time segments. So really personalized. So I'm just going to move on to the next one. So personal glucose target setup. So really, as low as clinically appropriate works better for the child. And this is just that it gives the system a little bit more power to adapt and adjust that basal when it needs to. So obviously in agreement with the family as well is important. The add meal function. So this is a really nice option within the app as well. That gives a little bit more options to how you bolus. So for example, the first one, the hypo treatment, you just type in the grams of carbs that you treated the hypo treatment, and then the system knows that it can be a bit softer after a hypo's happened. Also, as a HCP, it's really nice to see how much grams of carbs they're treating a hypo with, and to see that they're actually treating the hypo. So when you look back in the gluco, it's really nice to be able to identify that. The meal or snack option is great because you can tell the system that the child is going to have this snack. They might not need insulin for it, or they might not eat it all, but actually you can let the system know. And then there's also a slow absorbed meal option, which is where you can split the bolus for those high fat, high protein meals where you might need more insulin hours after the child eats. So here you can just see on gluco an example of what the add meal looks like. So you can see here there's lots of 1.7 units. So that they're only delivered if it's needed. So if the child's glucose levels do rise after that slow absorbed meal, it then allows the algorithm to give a little bit more insulin with those small boluses. So it can really help with those tricky meals. You can see here that hypo treatment was typed in for these hypos as well. So that's another add meal option. And then there's your slow absorbed meal. Here's another example on our PDF of how the hypo treatment comes up and how the slow absorbed meal comes up. So it looks a little bit different. So you can see 22 grams here is kind of shared, we'll say, over these few hours. So ease off, as we mentioned, this is a function to make the algorithm more relaxed. So it can be particularly helpful in things like hot weather or a lot of exercise. It reduces the AID and how much basically basal that it runs and reduces the insulin on board. So that's why it can be so helpful for exercise. It shuts off insulin delivery a little bit earlier than it would normally. So when to use it? So as I said, during exercise and following recurrent hypos. So if there's a day that maybe they're having more hypos, you can use ease off and hot weather, as we mentioned. Boost, again, is the other side of the coin. So it makes the algorithm a bit more responsive. It increases that insulin delivery when needed. But if the child's glucose starts dropping, Boost will shut off, so it's safe. It doesn't always keep that intensive, responsive basal going if it's not needed, so it is safe. When to use it, things like steroids, things that maybe are a bit not normal. So if they're a bit sick, so low-grade illness, coughs and colds, it works really well for things like that. And maybe post-infusion set failure. So when you have those maybe failed cannulas, Boost can work really well for that. So I'm going to hand over to Candice at this point to go through the routine clinic settings and adjustments.
Thanks, Kleena. So Kleena's sort of discussed really beautifully. These are all the features that you've got, but now we're going to put it together and how do I actually use it in this young population? And we're first going to be starting with what routine things do I need to think about when I'm in clinic to optimize, and then, moving on to the personal individual case. So next slide, please. So as Kleena has explained, your total daily dose is only put in once when you start the system, and every night around midnight, the algorithm updates total daily dose, and that will flow through to Gluco and the PDF. There's no need to optimize or change this total daily dose that you may need to do for another system. Total daily dose is also a metric of how much insulin the algorithm is allowed to deliver as a safety feature. So if you see on the right side of your picture here, there's a glucose information, and you can see the algorithm initially responded when glucose started rising, and then it flattened off. That is a sign that total daily dose is starting to be exceeded for the 24 hours that the algorithm is deemed safe to deliver for that individual and its learning. And often if you see this happening, this is a sign that there's a set failure, that actually a lot of insulin has been delivered, but it's not being effective. And so if you see this capping happening, it is a sign that maybe we need to do a set change. So it may be something you want to pass on to some families around, is this a set failure, or why isn't the algorithm working? It has tried hard, but the insulin's just not effective. So no total daily dose. Weight is the other thing. So body weight is the second parameter you put in when you start. And this really helps the algorithm in the post-meal phase, where the algorithm has an understanding of how much insulin is needed for carbohydrate and how much it needs to deliver based on the person's usual bolus behavior. It is only one of the features that it's used. So if body weight is slightly out, it is not going to make the algorithm out. And so we would recommend every 3 months in young children that body weight is reviewed in clinic and popped in and updated in the app. It goes up in 1 kilogram increments. Maybe our older children and young adults, that can be every 6 to 12 months if they're not growing rapidly. Thank you. Next slide. The basal rate. As we've explained, the actual basal sort of calculations or the settings are not used as part of the algorithm. And so adjusting the basal rate has no influence on the algorithm like it may do for some of the other hybrid closed loop systems. But the basal rate is there as a safety feature if open loop or manual mode is happening. For example, the sensor warm up. And so it needs to be optimized. As children grow, we would recommend that in around 3 monthly, when somebody comes to clinic, that you look at the data and think, what is the basal settings? Do we need to push those up or not? You'll see here on the right-hand side, glucose is showing you your basal bolus split for somebody on closed loop. We would expect with CAM-APS, the AID or the basal insulin delivered is higher because we often use add meal and so forth and asking the algorithm to cover some carbohydrate input, which a pump program basal you wouldn't be doing. So please do not use the how much insulin the algorithm is using as a metric for how much the pump basal needs to be programmed. We would recommend you look at total daily dose and then work out from your clinical experience, this age group, this child needs normally about 40%, I would expect. So you would then use your 40% of total daily dose rather than looking at the AID insulin. Happy to take questions about that later if you want to pop them in the questions section. Next page. Now we know its settings. Type 1 diabetes is though very complicated. So we need to also look at sort of behavior and management of the system. Bolus timing, carbohydrate counting, the use of add meal and other features like boost and ease off, as well as the system. You know, are we time in closed loop? We know from the research the more people spend in closed loop, the better the outcomes. And for a very sophisticated system, the weak point is still the infusion site, the cannula and infusion site. And so basic pump hygiene of is the site being changed regularly? Are there any lumps and bumps developing? Are they on the right cannula and are the set changes regular to be able to be sort of get the best insulin delivery? Let's look at next slide, please. So if you do see high day-to-day variability above what you would normally recommend for this age group, we would be thinking about are there missed boluses? Are there late boluses, delayed set changes, lumpy sites, and cannula issues that often influence the insulin absorption and delivery? And by addressing this, we can often get improvement in around 10% time in range. And so these fundamentals are really important to remind our families. They are busy, but it is important to try get these as right as possible. Thank you. I really like looking at the AGP. It gives me a lot of sort of clues about what's happening through the system. You can see this person that I showed earlier is having quite a bit of insulin. The algorithm is doing the lion's share of the work. Sort of 86% of the insulin is coming from the algorithm, only a small amount from the bolus. They are spending a nice amount of time in closed loop, 93% time in closed loop. In real world data, we would expect our users around above 90%, so averaging 94, 95, 96% time in closed loop. So they are using the system, but they're tending to be using quite a bit of boost, not too much ease off. They're not switching the system off at all, 0% auto mode off, and there's a little bit of tempting mode, which happens when the sensor gets changed. The algorithm will attempt to connect, but there's no sensor data, so open loop happens. Let's look at the next slide to just look at this in a little bit more detail. You can see what's happening. So this is the day glucose. There are no boluses. You can see the glucose data at the top, the algorithm working very hard and actually managing quite well without announced meals. Now, CAM-APS at this stage isn't fully closed loop. We are doing research into a fully closed loop system, but it is not designed. Pre-meal bolusing is important. And so this is somebody who we may be sort of be able to work with him as why they're not bolusing, or if bolusing is not an option at the moment, could we maybe find tips and techniques to help them maybe spread the carbohydrate, especially in the evening out, that there's not such a big dose that causes glucose levels to rise? Or is this rise in association with gaming or an adrenaline? And what can we do with a personal glucose target to maybe pull that down a little bit to help this individual get the time in range that they need for their journey in life? Next slide, please. So just as a reminder, meal bolusing we would recommend for insulin is about 10 to 15 minutes before eating. Because if the meal is given late, or the bolus is given late, the algorithm will start responding. You can see that initial respond at about 11 o'clock when glucose starts rising, the algorithm responds. And if the bolus is given at the end of the meal, you often sometimes have that, what we call sting in the tail, that dip of mixed, the insulin from the algorithm and the insulin from the bolus are fighting, and you get delayed hypoglycemia 2 to 4 hours later. So trying to get that bolus in before, or some of that bolus. Often people say, well, I don't know what my child's going to eat. Teenagers go, I don't know what's in the canteen. We would give a small amount of insulin that, the minimum for what's expected, that 10 to 15 minutes, and either give a second bolus afterwards or put the rest in add meal, should that be your choice. Next slide, please. Often people say to me, well, what happens if I forget and miss a bolus? We use a strategy that you need to clinically refine for that individual, but as a rule of thumb, sort of if you remember within 1 hour of eating, you may want to give maybe half the dose of insulin for the carbohydrates consumed. Because if you give the full dose, you're at risk of the algorithm have already given insulin and then the bolus being too strong, causing hypos. If it's within or after the hour's gone, you may just want to use boost for 2 to 4 hours and then review. Don't give the bolus because it's too late. And certainly, unfortunately, this individual is a great example of what not to do. They forgot their bolus at about 11 o'clock. They realized at 1 o'clock and put on boost. You see the green little up arrows on glucose. They then did a correction because insulin doesn't work instantly, so they were getting anxious. They then put in fake carbs, 15 grams, carried on using boost, and then gave a huge correction dose because they got so frustrated, and obviously ended up hypo, which is an issue. So we're trying to get, as soon as you realize, give the bolus up front or use boost. We do not recommend using a correction and boost together. That will cause hypoglycemia. So pick one or the other. Obviously checking if sets are working. On the other extreme, people say, well, if you want me to bolus 10 to 15 minutes before eating, what happens when I'm low? And do I still wait 10 to 15 minutes? And the answer is no. If you are on the low side of target, but not hypo, we would recommend that the person bolus the normal amount of insulin they normally require for that carbohydrate, but do not wait. Immediately start eating. Rather than bolusing late, like in this graph example, the person started eating, they bolused late, and they caused another hypo later on. If somebody's already, back to the first slide, if somebody's already hypo, so they're below the hypoglycemia threshold, we would recommend that they treat the hypo and ensure that their glucose level is back above that threshold with up arrows, and then bolus and eat immediately, just like the previous one. But people should not eat their meal until the hypo is fully treated. Thank you, Claire. A problem that people often don't realize is bolusing too early. Individuals, often parents, see that glucose level are high after the meal and they go 10 to 15 minutes isn't enough. I'm going to move to 20 or maybe even 30 minutes. And you can see this telltale image. You can see the glucose dose goes in. The insulin dose goes in, and actually glucose levels start lowering before they rise. You see this nice V on the graph. that is showing that that bolus has taken effect before the meal has taken effect. If we look down at the algorithm spots this glucose trend rise and it flattens down to 0, and it will not help in that post-meal period until that insulin on board has disappeared, and it can then help. So often you get this zigzag of glucose dropping and then rising because this mismatch in insulin. This may be one-off because there's food refusal, but if you see these telltale V's often on the graph, that is a sign that maybe you should be asking the family, how long before bolusing are you waiting? It might be too long and we need to bring it back to 10 to 15, or if it's 15, bring it back to 10 minutes, just to help with the right timing of insulin action. Next slide, please. Now, people often ask us also, what is a too stronger insulin ratio? Sorry, one back. Too stronger insulin ratio or too weaker insulin ratio look like? The algorithm has that post-meal learning, so it learns if somebody's insulin ratio is too weak. So on this graph, there's not enough insulin for carbohydrate. Glucose levels immediately start rising, and immediately the algorithm is working very hard after that meal. Versus the other extreme, we still have post-meal high glucose levels, but look at what the algorithm is doing in these graphs. The first one, or the one in the middle that says too strong, you can see there's no algorithm movement. It's sort of hiccuping. It's saying there's so much insulin on board from the bolus, I can't help. I'm just shut down to 0. I'm not delivering any insulin. And then you're losing the advantage of closed loop because the person just has to eat for the insulin that's on board. There's no use of ease off because the algorithm's already on 0. The far right graph is a little bit more complex to see. The ratio is not as strong, but you can see the bolus goes in, the algorithm is not working for almost an hour after the meal bolus. Sorry, please go back to the next slide. And glucose levels are already rising and then going on. And so this is probably the ratio is not as extremely strong, but I would still be reducing it. In the main, we find often our insulin to carb ratios are slightly weaker, less aggressive than maybe on another system, just because of the way the algorithm helps in the digestion. Next slide. So let's look at a few examples of this in practice. So this is a young individual, total daily dose of 8.3. You can see we're getting around 60% time in range, but we want to get higher. 4% level of hypoglycemia, which is really the issue. There's more hypos that the parents are saving. So we can't get the higher time in range because of that hypos. You can see there's quite a bit of insulin variability with the standard deviation above 3 and the SV, the coefficient of variation, sitting in the 40s rather than in the high 30s as we'd like. They are using the system. Time in range is auto mode time is 98%, so it's not connectivity issues or anything that's affecting us. So let's look on the next slide. As a reminder for you, the two settings we can adjust is the insulin to carb ratio and the target we're aiming for. The other features are used for open loop. So the target is sitting a little bit higher than we'd ideally like, 6.5 across the 24 hours of the day. We like it lower at night, generally from night to waking, to get good sort of more time in range, where it's easier to get time in range. And then you can see where the ICR is. So let's look at the detail to look at examples. So next slide. I quite like putting the days together, because what happens around midnight will influence what happens in the early morning. And if you're just scanning 24 hours, you often miss this pattern. So you can see the hypos that are happening around 6 in the morning are the reason why the personal glucose target is still sitting at 6.5. And the family and clinicians want to get away from these hypos. Raising the target further up is not going to help this. What will help for it is you can see high glucose levels around midnight in the early hours of the morning, which the algorithm is trying to correct. So we need to work back. Why is glucose level so high going into bedtime? is it the personal glucose target that's sitting on 6.5, and that might be clinically, it should be 5, 5.5 or 6 in this individual? What's happening with their insulin to carb ratio? Is the management of the meal, the bolus timing, appropriate to stop that glucose levels going up? Is there, carbs that are being consumed? So by dealing with what's happening in the evening with the right insulin to carb ratio, bolus timing, and personal glucose target, you'll get away from the hypo. Let's look at the next slide. You may have noticed these little hiccups. They're called patency pulses. We can go on to the next slide. They are a sign that the algorithm is being switched off, and the algorithm is designed to deliver a single pulse, which is 0.04 units of insulin every 90 minutes, just to maintain the pressure in the infusion line to prevent blockages or occlusions. This looks on the graph like 0.2 units, but it's because the basal is in units per hour. And so this is looks like 0.2 units, but just for a short sort of 10-minute segment. And often people say to us, oh, the patency pulses are causing the hypo. Then they're not. The patency pulses are a sign that there's too much insulin on board. The algorithm has switched off for many, many hours, and you see these little hiccup patency pulses. They may be very normal overnight, especially newly diagnosed or low total daily dose, so they're not a worry if that is the case. But if you do see them a lot, it is a flag to say, what's going on? Why is there so much insulin on board? Let's look at the next slide. This is a great example. This is our PDF report. If you haven't seen it before, you can see time in range is 64% of the time. There's no hyperglycemia reported in the stats, but there's a big burden of hyperglycemia that the parents are treating hypos at the level of 5 millimoles and asking the nursery to do the same. And so there's quite a bit of high glucose levels. Let's look at the next slide. So you can see great examples of these little patency pulses. There's one just before 2 in the morning, before 5, before 6, between 10 and 11, and so they go on. The same for the next day. Yellow is when ease off is being delivered. And so the patency pulses are there. The algorithm is not causing the hypos. It's the mismatch in bolus. So if we look on the first top graph, you can see breakfast, 1 unit of insulin for 26 grams. The algorithm is doing nothing until an hour later, showing that insulin on board from that bolus is just too strong. If we look at that example later on, you can see each time a bolus is given, the algorithm is doing nothing. So the solution to this is actually giving less insulin via the bolus calculator. And until you've got the right dose of the algorithm supporting in that post-meal stage. And once you've done that, you'll get rid of the hypos, and then you can pull the personal glucose targets down slightly, maybe to 6 during the day and low overnight to get that great 70% plus time in range. Let's look at the next graph. There is one thing that a lot of parents report in our very young children, that they see this what we call as a dusk phenomenon. You can see this is, I missed this old Diacen graph where you could see across the 24 hours of the day, where things, you can see time in range just dips off towards the end of the day with glucose levels rising. It's not consistent. It can be 1 night in 7. It could be 2 or 3 nights in 7. And therefore the algorithm's not going to learn about it because it looks for patterns. If it happens 1 night and then not for another 6 or 7 nights, it's not going to look at it. It's not going to be able to get on top of this. So this is just a tool that I would keep in my back pocket. I would not use it as a first strategy. First, you need to do what we did in this case that we just discussed. Ensure that the insulin to carb ratio is right. Ensure that the personal glucose target is at the right level for that child. And then when this starts happening, parents will report, I see the arrows start turning up. They're two arrows up. And I know it's just going to fly from great levels at 9 o'clock at night up into the 15s. We then give something called a preemptive strike, or that's what we've named it. Let's next slide. This is a small dose of insulin. It is, sorry, next slide. It is not a correction because it's given at a glucose level within target. So at the top range of target, maybe 9 or 10 millimoles. They're not high. Sorry, can I have the next slide? They're not high already, but it's that trend, those 2 arrows up on the glucose trend that's showing glucose levels are starting to rise. You may, in some families, now this is very important, you use your clinical experience to know when to use it and when not to. You may suggest that when parents see this glucose level that was tracing beautifully stable and then the child falls asleep and starts rising, that they give a small conservative dose via the bolus calculator just to help the algorithm to give an instant small dose of insulin. So we'd open the bolus calculator, press next. The dose of insulin is offered as 0.0. You can slide this up or down via scroll wheel and agree a dose. When you see this, give 0.2 as to stop that glucose rise. And then that plus the algorithm, I wouldn't use boost or anything, that plus the algorithm will help prevent the glucose level shooting to the 15 mark and get better management sooner. So this is, again, I stress, an important thing that you might need to use in very young children if you've got all the other settings right and this pattern still is happening on the odd night, that in the right family who you feel is able to manage this, they can then deliver a dose when glucose levels are rising very rapidly with a small amount of sort of a dose of insulin to help just get on top of that, but not a full correction. That will be too much. Next slide. So the last slide, this is somebody who was sent to us to say, why is your algorithm not working? What's happening here? How can we improve it? So you can see 40% time in range. Really, you know, we're not getting where we should be. But those of you for eagle eyes of you will see that we're only using 67% of the time CGM, and we're only using auto mode on for 40% of the time, and we're switching off auto mode 20% of the time. So let's look on the next graph. So this is something to discuss with that individual. Sorry, next slide. To discuss with that individual, why are they actively switching off auto mode? So the sensor data is there. They're actually wearing the sensor, but they've reverted back on purpose to open loop. They've slid the toggle to turn auto mode off on the algorithm. So it's important to discuss, is there a trust? Do you feel the settings aren't right? What's happening? On the next graph, just to show you the difference, if auto mode is on, but it's attempting, because there's no sensor data, you'll see this gray on glucose. Blue is when the auto mode is working. Yellow is when it's actually switched off. And I think it's important to tease out what's happening to be able to support this person doing managing better. Next slide. So to finish off, we have a few sort of top tips for optimization. The steepest learning curve is at the start, between the 1 to 3 weeks as the algorithm is learning that individual. But it never stops learning. It's constantly learning all the time. If you are in that first 1 to 3 weeks, we would recommend you still optimize the settings. I've had some people going, no, we're still learning. We don't need to do anything on the settings. If the settings are wrong, the algorithm's going to learn the wrong things. So it is important to review your insulin to carb ratio. Look at what the algorithm is doing after meals to decide, is the ratio too strong or too weak? Where did I start the personal glucose target? Did I start it a little bit high because the person was anxious? Can I start bringing it down, especially overnight? Making sure people aren't overusing boost and ease off, because these features need to be used for ease off for activity or boost when sick, but they shouldn't be used to try drive the algorithm to learn quicker, because they actually hamper the learning. We would encourage people not to use manual correction, so not to go into the bolus calculator and give extra insulin. The algorithm is constantly correcting, and often if manual corrections cause hypos. You may, on 2 occasions, decide manual correction if you've had a set failure and glucose is very high. Maybe you're in the 20s without ketones. A correction will bring that person down quicker than boost will, and that might be a clinically appropriate thing if you agree. And obviously open loop. We would not recommend fake carbs to force an extra dose of insulin. That is not necessary. If people want to give extra insulin, do it via the manual correction route. Pre-meal bolus timing is still important. We can't get away from that. The action of insulin is just not quick enough, but it is important to support people on how to maybe give this in a realistic way. And then always troubleshoot the tech. If you're not getting 90+% time in closed loop, please reach out to Ypsomed, because there are very easy top tips to support individuals get that time in range that we know across our population people are getting to get the best benefit. Right, I think we're going to move on to taking some questions, because we've covered the sort of overview of what we wanted to cover. So we're going to stop sharing. I don't know if there are any questions in the chat or anybody has anything they want to ask. If not, I'm sure we've got extra discussion points that we can bring into the questions.
So I can't see any questions right now, so please feel free to pop them in there if you have any questions to our speakers.
Give you a few more minutes. Clina, when
may I ask you?
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead.
Go
May I ask you to highlight a little bit about the steps and the targets for small children? What differs the system from other systems, please?
Now, I think that is a really, really key question, because actually I recently was doing some road shows and webinars in Europe, and what I found when I visited clinics is everyone tended to have too stronger insulin to carb ratios, and as a result the personal glucose target had to be higher to prevent hypos, and they were just not getting the time in range. And so it's really important to make sure you've got the right insulin to carb ratio and have that personal glucose target as low as possible, especially in the young children. So I don't know, Clina, you jump in as well. I would, obviously everybody is different, and so giving targets is tricky, but for a young person, so under 6 with a low total daily dose, I think having a higher target during the day is great for that. Just it helps save that mad 5 minutes that they're rushing around and doing unplanned activity, or maybe a little bit of food refusal, that we keep from, I generally say, an hour before waking to either evening meal or bedtime, that daytime target slightly higher. 6.5, somewhere there is sort of what you're ideally aiming for. You may take a while to get there, but that's what you're ideally aiming for. And why an hour before bed? Because often these children jump out and they run around like mad. So it's just to help stop that hypo before breakfast. And then from the evening meal or bedtime to midnight, that's crucially where the child is often sleeping. The risk of hypos is a lot lower. They actually have a risk of high glucose levels because of that dusk phenomenon. And so I try be as aggressive as I feel clinically appropriate at that time of day. So somewhere maybe 5.5 or maybe even 5. We do not go below 5 for children. That is exclusively kept in pregnancy. So I often do see children at the level of 4.5, 5, and then there's a big burden of hyperglycemia, so we wouldn't go down that far. And then from midnight to waking, I tend to be a bit higher because of that risk of hyperglycemia from sort of 2 to 6 in the morning, so maybe 6 or 5.5. So from midnight, 5.5 to 6, from during the day, sort of 6 to 6.5, and from, in the evening, from sort of 5 to 5.5. But obviously this needs to be clinically appropriate for that individual is what we're sort of aiming for.
Sometimes what I see on downloads as well is a family having to use Boost a lot, and actually having to use Boost a lot, then your personal glucose target is probably too high. The family are then almost having to do more work than they have to, because actually you need to make that algorithm work for you. And I think maybe that comes from being used to not with other systems not being able to have that flexibility with the personal glucose target. So the personal glucose target is set and that's it, you can't change it. But in this system, you've got that flexibility. So, you know, really customizing it to the child's routine, I think makes the system just work so much better.
Absolutely. I just noticed in the chat here a few other questions have come through, and thank you, Ria, for just wanting to confirm. Yes, so when you're treating a hypo before a meal, I'm meaning treated with your rapid acting rescue carbs, your jelly babies, your whatever, you dextrose tablets or whatever, to fully treat rapidly before the meal. That is important, that it goes in first, fully treated, and then goes back up again. And you put those extra carbs, if you can, in ad meal under hyper treatment. The algorithm's not going to cover those extra carbs. It's just going to say, thank you very much for telling me that's on board. There's a question about dilute insulin. Now, dilute insulin is probably a sort of whole question all on its own, whole webinar all on its own. So do reach out to us if you've got any questions. We would generally recommend you start thinking about dilute insulin when you've got, especially somebody newly diagnosed who's like to go into the honeymoon phase and their total daily dose is below 5, absolutely. But I would also start thinking sort of on the 6 to 8 mark, total daily dose, pump total daily dose, if somebody especially is going to go into honeymoon and there's that risk of dropping. So yes, we've got lots of sort of information, lots of clinical experience with using dilute insulin with these young children. It is off license, but we can share our experience with you. But it is important that you don't use normal undiluted U100 insulin in a very young child with a total daily dose below 5. That is completely off license and the system will struggle. So, but there are ways to support individuals on pump therapy and moving on to CAM APS in those neonatal diabetes. I think our youngest we had on the systems was 2 weeks old when they started. Clina, you were involved with that case when you went to that.
It was a little 6-week-old baby. Yeah. So, and we had to dilute to U5 because he was needing so little dose. But you know, when you have a child that age, there's no other option. You need something. Yeah.
Absolutely. So do reach out to us. So just keep in your mind, definitely under 5, you have to either dilute or wait to start. If it's below 6 to 8, it may be worth a conversation with us about what are the pros and cons between them. And then I'm glad this question came up. It always comes up. iOS and Android. Yes, the system is Android at the moment. Android only. Our iOS app, we are waiting for CE marking, which we should get any day now. And then a global rollout launch will happen as soon as we have the CE marking country by country. And we will communicate that with you as soon as we have firm dates. But the CE marking from our regulatory authority, we have no control over when it's going to come, so we just have to wait patiently. We are as anxious for it as you are. Okay, thank you. And I think we're running out of time. I just want to, on that note, since we're talking about iOS, we do have an event at ATTD on March 19th, so please sign up for that, and we will share some updates on iOS at that time also. And that will be a little bit more about tailored treatments and for all patient groups, not just young children. So please join if you can. And regarding the next webinar, I think we will have that in second week of April. And that will be the topic of teens and young adults. Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Brilliant. Thank you for organizing the webinar. It's been brilliant to speak, and thank you to my co-speaker, Clina. Really great. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for joining, and thank you, Candice and Fiona.